not that long ago, my dad had made a comment about like, oh, I didn't raise my girls to be Black girls.
Ah, hey, beautiful people of the internet. Welcome back to our podcast. So happy that you guys are here again for another beautiful interview with Julie, Fatmata, and I.
Like Hawa said, welcome back to our channel. Today we have Julie with us. We are so excited to have her. She found us on Instagram, and she's another adoptee that was adopted by a white family, and she just could not be happier to be part of this, and we are so happy that she's here. I will read off a little bit about who Julie is. Julie was born in a village in northern Cameroon, West Africa. She was adopted by white missionaries who were living in the area. When she was 9, her parents moved back to the United States, and she spent the rest of her childhood in northern Minnesota. I'm also from Minnesota, by the way, so there's a commonality right there. Julie is an attorney and now lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with her husband, John, and her fur baby, Mr. Darcy. So, Julie, is there anything else that you want to add from your bio?
No, I mean, I guess I could have said adopted family. I don't always like sometimes use those terms just because my parents got me when I was 4 months old. So
Mm-hmm.
it sometimes it's like it will come in and out. People are like, wait, which one's your family? I'm like, well, family. Sometimes I'm like, growing up in a white space and then people look at you like you're crazy. And I was like, I gotta explain.
Yeah.
Adopted. Okay, let me
Yeah.
preface this. So yeah.
Yeah. And even sometimes when you say adopted, because people think, oh, she's probably, got adopted by like a Black family. People don't always think, oh, white family adopting a Black child.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's why I really resonated when I realized like there was a platform people discussing
mhm,
transracial adoption because
mhm,
I was like, oh, wait, because it really explains me. Like it's not
mhm.
just adopted by the same ethnic group, but adopted by a white family. So yeah.
Okay.
Hmm. So just to get this right, so when your parents, so they adopted you from a missionary, like a church kind of program. They went on missionary act. They went to, it was Haiti, right? Or
No, Cameron.
Cameroon.
Cameron. Yeah.
And
Cameroon.
then they actually lived there for a short period of time before they moved back to the United States, or?
Yeah, so the complex part of the story is my dad's parents were missionaries in Cameroon,
Mhm,
white family missionaries in Cameroon. He grew up there, came back to the States, got married, went back out there as missionaries, and they had two biological children. And
mhm,
my mother had always wanted more kids. And
mhm,
so she had the two boys and she wanted more kids. And then my birth mother came to them and said, hey, like, I have a child that I will not be able to take care of because of the nature of how everything
mhm,
was going on with the fact that she was married, but she didn't know who my birth father was. So there was just like, and in those kinds of cultures, the
mhm.
child is the one that suffers.
Yeah.
And so she really knew that I would grow up as an outcast. And so she came to them and was like, hey, like, would you be open to adoption? And of course, my mom was like, yes. She was still pregnant at the time. So my mom didn't
Mhm,
even know, like, my adopted mom didn't even know boy or girl or anything like that. And
mhm,
so, yeah, they ended up getting me at 4 months old. And the full entire process of like getting the adoption legalized took a really long time, but I won't have to go into that because that's just another whole podcast in itself. But um so yeah, and they lived as missionaries. They were still like living there in the village. And then
mhm,
about 5.5 years later, they adopted a second time and another little
mhm,
girl from another village. So they ended up with two adoptees
mhm,
and then two biological. So yeah, and then when they went out, they finally were like, all right, we're kind of done with living here and doing this. And they came back
mhm,
to the States. And my dad has family from up north. He was born in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and
mhm,
so they ended up choosing to live in Minnesota. And my mom's family is from Atlanta, so that's why, that's my Atlanta connection. But that's kind of like the gist of like where it all
mhm.
started. And that's why it's like, yeah, adopted by missionaries, but they were already living there and that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. So they didn't like go through an organization. They just were kind of like,
Yeah.
oh, here's a kid in need. Let's adopt it.
Mhm,
But there were definitely a lot of problems
Yeah.
with kind of the lack of knowledge, and not just lack of knowledge, like just not thinking through stuff. So
Hmm.
Well, that's very. Oh, go ahead, Emily.
Oh no, I was just gonna ask, do you still have a connection with your birth family?
Mhm.
So I had contact. I did grow up like because it wasn't mine wasn't open adoptions. My sister's was not.
Okay.
I did have some contact with my birth mother for a few years. The last time I saw her, I think I was 11. But then she was like getting married and kind of starting a whole new life, and so it kind of felt
Mm-hmm.
like this. It was going to be like kind of easier to just kind of like we kind of went our separate ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't had contact with. Some of that is like I think kind of stems back to how my parents handled the adoption,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that I felt like I was kind of told, this is how you're supposed to feel about this person, this is who this person is in your life, and
Mm-hmm.
very like kind of coached through everything. So I didn't really feel like it was really like a safe space for me to really be like, oh, do I want this relationship or do I not? Kind of a situation was just like, okay, this is a person, she's the birth mother, she's going to come visit me,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of situation.
Okay.
And I think another layer which you guys probably understand and some people don't always relate to is because of the disparity of like income kind of situations. um I
Mm-hmm.
remember one time going and visiting and like them being like either jealous of stuff in different situations.
Mm-hmm.
And I understood, like, I mean, I'm now an American, and to them, like, oh my gosh, like, you're amazing, all this different stuff. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that dynamic really made it hard to like really understand. But then I had the other layer of like, not positive comments either because that culture just didn't know understand like what to do with a child that doesn't have a
Yeah.
father. And
Mm,
so I think for me, I was like, I don't need that in my life. For me, being adopted, like, I never had an issue with the fact that um, I never wondered, oh, what would it be like to have been raised by my birth family? Like, I've
Mm-hmm.
never had that idea ever in my head. And I think because of the nature of it wasn't born to mom and a dad and then this kind of situation, but they were just poor. It wasn't even that. It was like a mom and then who knows who the father is, and like, and in that culture that just doesn't work. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, I think that part was like, I was like, you know what, that's fine. I don't really like the clashes of the worlds are just kind of really hard
Mm-hmm.
to navigate. So I just never really, did, because I didn't know what I would do with it. Like, oh, I'm gonna come in as like this, like, you know, to them rich girl when I wasn't really,
yeah,
but
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
because they have this misconception that money grows on trees in
yeah,
America, and that
yeah,
we are
Mhm.
just all rich and filthy rich, and we just have it like that. It's like that's not what it is. But
yeah.
that's very interesting that you kind of have that perspective with your family versus how and I in our families where we still have a connection with them, and it's like they like the fact that we are here because they were going to send them like all this money, so they want to keep that connection in that way. The connection that they keep is not necessarily, for me personally, the connection that they keep is not necessarily to get to know me better, but to kind of be like that, the person shuffling the money back.
Well,
Um,
and I think that's what my adopted mom was really worried about, was she could already
mhm.
see that pressure being put on me at a really young age, like,
Yep.
5, 6, 7 years old.
Yeah.
you know
Yep.
and my
Yeah.
mom
I
was
was.
like, this is just a lot for her to be seen
Yeah.
as like this money machine, and have
Yeah.
these expectations that she's supposed to take care of them and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I guess the difference too is like, I knew that they weren't necessarily at the like it wasn't war torn at the time, like, you know what I
Hmm.
mean, like there were different situations where it was just kind of like, I don't
Yep.
know. So for me, I didn't want that type of a, I guess in a sense, a relationship.
Hmm.
And I knew, I was like, yeah, like I'm adopted. I'm here and I get to live a very different life. So I didn't have the same like, what if they
Hmm.
had been able to keep me? Because I've seen the village and I would not want to grow up there at all.
Yeah.
So that's one perspective that I think was very different from a lot of people who are like, oh, like what if they had been able to keep me, and like always kind of
Hmm.
those what if questions.
Hmm.
I never had those.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was actually a conversation we last had in our video was whether or not if we could go back and get adopted again, or we kind of like explored, okay, well, maybe if either we got adopted by people that were not white, or if we stay with our birth family, and just like navigating those conversations, because I think that's like you said, that's very common thought of a lot of adoptees because they didn't have the type of opportunity you had. It's very interesting because it's like you kind of were in your hometown where you got kind of nourished a little bit because you left when you were like 5, 6 years old, right?
Hmm.
And then on top of that, it's like you got to build this relationship with your adoptive family in a place that you're comfortable with and that you know, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of us, we kind of are like, well, it's not adoption is not fair because the child gets ripped from their hometown, everything that they know, and they get
Mm-hmm.
shipped to a foreign land and they have to learn how to adapt and change. Not that you didn't have to do that when you were 6 years old, you obviously you did, but you got to at least build that connection and that relationship with your family in a place that was familiar. So I was curious to know, like, um, when you were at home, like it's still in your birth town, did your birth family like ever come to like visit you? Did you ever get that
Yeah.
chance to like interact with your birth family and your adoptive family?
Yeah, so I guess I would like clarify one part where like yes, I was like adopted, in the same village and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But something I think that's different for me was that my adopted family didn't know how to handle
Mm-hmm.
that relationship. So what I ended up feeling was that yes, I was there and I saw my birth mother and did different things, but it was always a very awkward and tense dynamic whenever I'd have to see them. So my birth mother ended up, moving to a different town just to kind of she needed a different, slate and all that kind of stuff because I was going to follow her as well.
Mm-hmm.
But her parents were there. So like my birth grandparents, and there would have been like aunts and uncles and all that kind of stuff were there.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were very connected to like my family because my dad was a pastor of a church and they had been at the church before. So there was like a lot of different dynamics and stuff like that with it.
Mm-hmm.
But what I felt like what was hard was that like my parents, I would say more specifically like my dad, would always have these like conversations with me like beforehand. And I felt like now looking back, it's this kind of um I guess maybe trying to protect but kind of dictating like okay how you're supposed to feel like hey this
Mm-hmm.
person is coming. I want you to do this. I don't want you to do like kind of handle the situation. I'm 3 years old.
Yeah, I was
Right.
gonna
You know what I
say
mean?
I
And
know.
so
you're so young.
like
Yeah.
let me be a kid and
Baby.
have my feelings and have my thing. And I
Yeah.
think that's the thing like when you guys had that discussion on your podcast about like would you change being adopted. For
Mm-hmm.
me it wasn't the fact that I was adopted, it was how the adoption happened and
Mm-hmm.
how I had a second chance to have a different childhood,
Mm-hmm.
and then they still like failed on so many
Yeah.
levels. And so I
Yeah.
think that for me is where like I feel like my heart is because there are these situations that you can't control.
Yeah.
um like for me, like I was in a situation where like either I was going to be a second class citizen at best,
Mm-hmm.
living in a country, maybe never even getting married because it would have been no one to pay the dowry. I don't know, like all kinds of like just
Mhm,
really tragic situations. So like there was never like oh, I want that life. But it was
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, now when you're gonna take a child and you're going to adopt them, you need to do extra work.
Mm-hmm.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so I think that was the thing. So interacting, with them, yeah, I did get to interact with them, but I think back like I have no picture with my birth mother. I have no picture of my birth mother,
Mm-hmm.
which like now I'm like that is so weird. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we did take pictures back then, so it's not like, I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
not that I'm saying I was old, but there were pictures that were being taken, but I don't have one of her.
Yeah.
So I think those are things that have been like, okay, maybe handle that a little differently.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
Yeah, I can
interesting.
totally, yeah, I can totally understand that. So now let me ask you a question. So when you moved to the States and you started living with your family, like what were like unique challenges that you faced in like navigating like cultural, you know, differences? And I know you talked about there are certain things that you felt like your parents could have done better, your adoptive parents. So if you don't mind sharing a little bit what you were
Yeah.
meaning in that aspect.
So when we ended up moving to Minnesota, they chose to live in Minnesota. Northern
Hmm.
Minnesota is 6 miles from the Canadian border. Um, and there's nobody else that looks like me or my sister. And they had one place, they'd had a place in Indiana at one time, and they knew that there were some racial issues there, which was true.
Hmm.
Um, but instead of like really exploring other options, they chose what was comfortable for them.
Hmm.
And for them, what was comfortable was to be up north. My dad wanted to be up north. They wanted to live in the country. And that was the
Hmm.
other problem. They'd had some places that had been in the country, rural areas. And then I was like, yeah, of course that's going to be bad. Like, we all know, like,
Yeah.
rural is just not where you go. Like, if you don't look like, if you look like us, you don't go to rural places. And so that I think was the big thing, was like they really just took us to northern Minnesota. And I was like, okay, but why?
Yeah.
Nobody looks like us at all.
Yeah.
And what I realized was like there was never this idea of putting themselves in an uncomfortable situation.
Mm.
One time my mom made a comment. She said, well, we weren't sure like how other black people would take it, that these, white people were raising these two black girls, and like what they would think. And I was like, yeah, but you guys are, like, in my head, I'm like, you guys are adults.
Yeah.
We're kids.
Hmm.
So we're just having to just like live here and live in this space that's extremely white.
Hmm.
People asking me questions like, did you have a pet tiger in Africa?
Oh,
Do you
Lord.
speak
Oh my God.
English?
Yeah.
Random ladies touching my hair in the grocery store. And I
Yeah.
was telling my husband this one story about the lady in the grocery store, and he thought I was like a little kid. He's like, not that that was good. I said, no, I was like 14. And then like random little old ladies, oh, I haven't ever seen hair like this. And I was like,
Yeah.
so just all those kinds of like comments and things like that. And
Hmm.
so just,
It's so funny. It's so funny to me. Like we actually created it wasn't even us like speaking this out. We did like a video where we reposted this lady who adopted black kids, and she's
yes,
white. And
yes,
she
I
was like,
love it.
if you are adopting black children or any other race outside of like Caucasian, make sure that you um, put yourself outside of your like comfortable shoes. Maybe move to a place that's more diverse, or
Hmm.
maybe seek out like mentorhood or friendships that are outside of your race, whatever. And
Hmm.
people just went like that shit crazy in the
Yeah.
comments because they thought it was just so like disgusting that someone who was white who adopted a black child could even say something like that, and that we as adopted people
Hmm.
agreed with her sentiment. And it's like we say this stuff because people live through that experience,
They
stuff like that.
do.
That's why we go so hard on it, because it's not a dream world. It's something that happens on a day-to-day basis,
It
Yeah.
really,
And
it really
it
does. And I think something that's interesting that I noticed was like, for you guys, I know you guys came to the States when you were like 8 or something.
mhm.
Mhm,
8 and 9.
Um, 8 and 9,
mhm,
so having been over there, and then coming and then living, but I think what's interesting is, I was raised with a white family from a very, very, very tiny age. And I think there's this other misconception that, hey, if we adopt a child when they're a baby,
mm, yeah.
they're not going to have this other culture. Okay.
Good
They're not going to have this other like
point.
black
Yeah.
culture or African culture or whatever it is that you want. And so we're
Mhm.
just going to like raise them just like we raise the rest of our kids.
Mhm,
And that's what my parents did. And what I really have like the heart for telling people is like, you can't raise them exactly the same,
Mhm.
because I was not raised to be a black woman in the United States. I
Mhm.
was not prepared
Mhm.
at all to be a black
Yeah.
woman in the United
Yeah. I
States.
remember I remember you and I talking about that a little bit on Instagram. So, yeah. I totally,
Yeah.
yep.
And so there was never, I will say the one thing that my mom did get right was my mom did figure out the hair thing.
Mhm.
She tried really hard to learn how to braid. She learned how to do like different things like that. So she was like, I'm gonna, I don't want her to feel like she has to be white with her hair.
Mhm.
But everything else though was, oh, complete white world.
Mhm.
And, in my head at the time, you're a child, you're not thinking all these things are really like
Mhm.
happening. You're just kind of like, okay, like I'm not like anybody else. Everybody's asking me these awkward questions. I really just want to just be this like introvert that like,
Mhm.
can just walk through a room and nobody pays attention to me. Um, but I knew I was reminded that this really was the case when not that long ago, my dad had made a comment about like, oh, I didn't raise my girls to be black girls.
Ah,
Yeah.
wait, your white
That's
dad said that?
And I
yeah.
was like, okay,
Okay, wait,
so
hold up, hold up. That's gonna be the title of this freaking video. I'm sorry. That
yeah,
what?
yeah.
What?
And
Can you give us a little bit of background story? Like, what happened? Why did he feel like that was appropriate for him to even say that?
so I think in some ways, I think there was like, and I remember this happening before, like there'd be some comments. There was kind of this negative idea of American blacks and a black,
Mhm.
and I didn't realize that the American black woman was like a negative thing that he had embodied, to
Mm-hmm.
be honest.
Mhm.
But he raised us from birth and he could raise us to be, all these different things. And it kind of come to light with some other stuff that had been going on.
Mm-hmm.
And he made that comment. He made it first to somebody else. And then he said it again. And I was like,
Wow.
He
but
said that
wait.
out loud publicly to somebody else.
And I was like, I think he said it to, I don't remember if he said it to my husband. I think he might have said it to my husband.
Wow.
But the point that I was like, okay, so all these things that I've thought in my head were all true.
Mm-hmm.
Of
Yeah.
like the white savior mentality
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
was really there.
Mhm.
In the sense, this idea of like, we're gonna adopt these black girls, we're gonna give them this new life, all these things, and they're gonna be just like us, like we're gonna love them, and do all these, we're gonna love them just like my other kids, but
Mhm.
not do the things to support us as black women in the United States. And I was
Mhm.
like, and I understand if you're like, oh, well, technically you're African more than, and I was like, okay, I don't even know. Like,
Mhm.
okay, yes, I am African American, truly am African American, born in Africa, raised in America. I get
Mhm.
that, but I'm also still a black woman.
Right.
Mhm.
And
It's almost like it's a superiority like complex where it's like
Yeah. Oh my God. Yes.
our who we are, our culture is the highest at the top, and
Yeah.
so that's what we want to raise these children to be. And like being a black person is at the bottom of the barrel. Why would
Mhm.
we adopt a child from Africa for them to just be at the bottom of the barrel? We want them to be high up
Yeah.
here of whiteness.
And I
well,
think that's the same thing that I think for me, I don't want to speak for you, Hawa, is the same thing that kind of happened to me as well. Because her and Julie and I talked about a little bit about the whole being a black woman, how we had to learn. I had to learn how to be a black woman outside of my
Oh
family by
yeah,
talking to
oh
other
yeah.
black girls, like talking to other black girls, because our parents never took the time to actually learn what it is to be a black girl living in America. Because, like you said, they're trying to raise us into this hierarchy of, well, just, my mom used to say things like, well, just fit in. You don't have to think about that stuff. Like, why are you thinking about that stuff? It's like, no,
Mhm.
it's not that I don't want to, I'm trying to think about that stuff on purpose. It's just who I am. It's part of
Just
who
what
my identity is.
comes to your mind. Like
Yeah.
you live a
Yeah.
completely different experience. And
Yeah.
I've also, I've also had very similar experiences where I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't taught how I couldn't be taught how to be black in the household. Like I had to go outside. And that's why I was putting myself in a lot of dangerous
Mm-hmm.
environments. And what I thought was black was truly
Mm-hmm.
the bottom of the barrel, not because they were black, but because they were
Mm-hmm.
doing some crazy things. You know what I mean? And but then I had to learn, okay, there's different types of black. you know, I'm sure your dad didn't even think about that when he was making
Mhm.
comments like this. Black
Yeah,
is more.
and I think that's the thing. Like I remember another family that had adopted a black boy, and they had made, I remember there was a thing like we'd hear the stories about, oh, like he went through, when he was in high school, he kind of went through this phase of like all he wanted to do was hang out with like black kids, and he's like, listening music, just and didn't want anything to do with white people. And I was like, okay, first of all, it was in middle of nowhere, Minnesota. There weren't that
Mhm.
many black people, first of all.
Mhm.
And second of all, of course, he's gonna find a certain level of comfort
Mhm.
with maybe that, because he's not getting asked those same awkward or weird questions. And
Mhm.
so I was like, but I remember hearing that kind of like as a negative of like, oh, if you like become too black, you're gonna like hate white people or something. And
Yeah.
I'm like, no, that's not the case. It's just that we live a different experience,
Mhm.
as far as shopping,
Mhm.
like walking into grocery
Ooh,
stores,
that's a
Mhm.
good
driving
one. Mm,
places, having the cops
Yeah.
follow me, like all those types of things that I was not prepared for at all. And thank God,
Right.
and same for, and I'm sure for you guys, we're all safe now.
Yeah.
But lots of things could have happened.
Yeah. Like just in general, just the black experience. And
Yeah.
it's unfortunate. Like fortunately my for me, my parents, as they grew older, as we got older, they actually took the time to actually read and actually understand what it's like being black. Even though there's times they still weren't, getting it right. And but yeah, it's like you cannot raise your black child to be white. Like it's impossible. It's not
Yeah.
going to work. It's just we
Yeah.
are going to face different things in this lifetime. Like no matter how hard you try, and it's unfair for
mm,
families to adopt. And how and I we always talk about this. When you're adopting a black child, you have to think outside of yourself. You have to do like the deep research, and you have to have people in your corner that are not white. Like some people are at least black, so you can like talk to them and have a relationship and be like, hey, I know you're white and your child is black. You got to look out for these certain things. Like when your kid walks into a grocery store and or a store, and they're going to be looked at differently. Like for example, I was adopted with another black kid who became my brother, and I have another brother. It's like they're the same age, and there's times where they would walk into a store together, and the
Mhm.
way my black brother is treated versus my white brother was night and day. And so
Mhm.
we had to teach, my parents had to realize, oh, we have to actually learn, about what
Mhm.
it is to be black. But it's
mm,
so interesting to just kind of try to like, oh, I don't see color, I'm just gonna, raise them
Yeah.
how it's like, no,
Yeah.
it doesn't
Yeah.
work.
And that really was the case. It was like, oh, we just don't see it. And and the thing is I was so protected and so sheltered from everything. My parents did
Hmm.
that, and they homeschooled. It kept us very, my mom was like, well, I was, worried about, people saying making, racist jokes or all that kind of stuff. And I was like, okay, I get that. But then the problem that happened was like there was this protection, I guess, in one sense that happened because, everywhere I'd go, I was always with, oh, there's the white parents too. And
Hmm.
but then there's at some point when you're an adult and you go places and you're
Hmm.
suddenly by yourself, and
Hmm.
now you don't have that same
mm,
protection.
mhm,
Yeah.
And so, if you've never prepared your child for that, or even given them, I feel like if some of it is giving them a space where they could find that from other people. No
Hmm.
one around me looked like me.
Yeah.
We had one family that we were friends with that was black, and I saw them, like I can count how many times I saw them,
mhm,
in my life. And so none of them looked, like me. So they're not going to have the same struggles, and you
Hmm.
know, um and those kinds of things, and living in a very white space where people are going to date somebody else
Hmm.
that looks like them. So
Yeah.
things like that, where it's like I think you need to be willing to put yourself in
Hmm.
uncomfortable situations and realize that you can't raise them
Hmm.
just like your own, even if you get them from birth. Because I
Hmm.
yeah,
think that's where some
mhm,
of the misconception is. Because people are like, oh, you come in five,
Hmm.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you have your
Hmm.
own culture. But if you're born and we get you from, the hospital, or we get you from the fact that you're a tiny baby, clean, brand new slate, we can, raise you the same as the rest. And,
Yeah.
you
And
can't.
I
And
feel
so
like
let me ask you, were your parents able to understand you in that regard? Now that you're older and you try to like, talk to them about this stuff, were they able to actually like understand you and understand that clearly you're not, they try to raise you like a white girl and you're not. Were they ever able to actually understand?
Not my father.
Okay.
My mom gets it now a little bit
Mm-hmm.
more. She kind of is like, I think she started to get it a little bit. I moved to Atlanta. My sister ended up moving to Atlanta, and she was like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, you ended up in Atlanta." I was like, "Yeah, two black girls in Atlanta. Surprise!" And I was like, "There's not a whole lot of surprise with that, especially since we do
Yeah.
have family here."
Yeah.
I would say that 2020, with all the stuff that happened in
Mm-hmm.
2020, that kind of really opened some doors, opened some windows to
Mm-hmm.
see it, because I saw, my brothers supporting
Mm-hmm.
people, and posting things, and I was like, what? And
oh,
then I told my mom, I said, they don't see us as black.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, oh yeah, they don't. I said, well, here's the problem. We are black, and we can speak to a bunch of different things. Maybe not everything. Obviously, I don't have somebody who's incarcerated. I don't have, there's not that kind of stuff, but I can speak to racism.
Right.
Like, and there would be like the or mis or treatment of all kind, like, and I realized was that there's this idea of like, this person is fine. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this person is fine because they're raised just like us or whatever, but they're not actually like
Mm-hmm.
black.
black, black.
Oh
And I
yeah,
was
I
like,
totally get it. There's been
Yeah.
times where I grew up, people were like, "Well, you're not really black though." I'm like, "What the fuck do you mean?"
girl, I used to have people be like, oh my gosh, like you're the whitest black girl I know.
That would. Oh, that
Or
would.
and then one of them was like, "Oh, you're like the only time your black side comes out is when you're mad." Which then I was like, I don't know how to take that one. I don't know how to take that.
That I've had that too. That's like I don't want to even say microaggression. That's aggression. That's just like stereotypical racist as can be.
And I mean, and it definitely sent me into like some identity stuff, because I was like,
Yeah.
okay, so if I'm obviously not white,
Yeah.
but if I'm not black,
Or
then like
black
what?
enough.
Black enough, because
Mm-hmm.
I'd gotten black enough from both sides. I'll be
Mm-hmm.
fair. Like I had gotten it from, white
Yep.
people and from black people too.
Yep.
And then I was like, but what? You know? But I will say the older and I've gotten, I feel like the more secure I've become
Mm-hmm.
as being a black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I've built up a support group with it. And I'll say, since the election in 2016 and then everything in 2020,
Yeah.
I definitely feel a lot more um I like better treated from other black people. Like I can't even think of like a much of like a negative story
Mm-hmm.
since then, really. But yeah,
I
so
really,
yeah.
I feel like I really give that to like social media as well.
Yes.
You have a lot of people who are coming on social media like these are all the stereotypes that are dumped on Black women and Black people. We're
Yeah.
supposed to sound like this and that.
Mm-hmm.
And you're seeing like Black people flourishing with different types of lifestyles,
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
different, of course they're Black, but they have different cultures. They have a different way of identifying themselves. So I think
Yes.
that's like, I think that really helps as well.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering like when did you like when you were in Minnesota like at what age and like when did you start having like awareness of like
Good
all of
question.
these differentiators between you and your family? When did you start
Mm-hmm.
seeing maybe some passive like racism within your family? Like we want to hear a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I noticed, I'd get, the comments, oh, like you're from Africa. Do you speak African? And then of course, little me, especially when I was really young, I'd go into like this whole lecture with people,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd be like, okay, so Cameroon's the size of California, and then it has over 200 different languages, not dialects. Like I would go on this rant because I was like, I'm gonna educate these white people. So I mean, I was used to like those types of comments, but I started to like seeing some of the ignorance. I remember when I was a teenager and I met a family that they had adopted a bunch of different kids, and one of them was black and super like very dark skin, like almost black.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the girls was like, "Oh yeah, like we adopted him from Africa." And I was like, or they said he's African. And I said, "Oh, that's cool. Like where from?" Like because I'm going to ask where in Africa, because Africa's
Mm-hmm.
not, it's a continent, not a country. And she's like, "Oh, I mean, I don't know where. I mean, he's black, so he's African." The guy come from Texas, okay?
God.
And
That's
I was like, "Okay,
The
like
ignorance.
no, like we can't do that. Like, no, Uh and so I think that was like I started to see, I was like, oh, okay, like that's problem. I think that I didn't really see as much of it within my family because of the fact that my mom has a decently diverse family. Like there's different people that have married in, and I think I had the misconception that if you adopt a black child, then you
Mm-hmm.
can't be racist.
Oh, yep. Yep.
That was my idea.
Newsflash.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I mean
Newsflash.
that was really my idea of it.
Mhm.
And I think it wasn't, I once I like went to college and I started to realize, like, why was I like raised in such a white space when we had the opportunity to not be raised in such a white space, because
Mm-hmm.
my mom has family in Atlanta and in Georgia. So I
Yeah.
was like,
Oh my
so
God.
why were
Because
we with the
the crazy thing about it is there's a lot of countryside of Atlanta and Georgia. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like she couldn't
Yeah.
have gone to the country over there. That's like maybe like an hour away from
From
like downtown
diverse.
or
Yeah.
something like that. Like
well, and
that's
they had
wild
tried
to me.
one area that's like super racist, and they were like, oh, we can't do that. But like I did have a black aunt. One of my mom's uncles had married a black woman, and my mom had asked her like some questions of some things. She had
Mm-hmm.
born in Kansas, lived in California, lived in like more Atlanta than like rural Georgia, so South Georgia, not North Georgia, because North Georgia's a bunch of white people.
Mm-hmm.
South Georgia has a lot more black people. And
Mm-hmm.
so they were South, and she said she just loved being in South Georgia with a bunch of black people. That was where she felt the most comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Which
think it
makes
went
sense.
back to like my parents not being willing to go into a space they didn't feel comfortable with. Like they went for their comfort kind of a thing. And then I think like as I got older and like politics started to make me realize, like, oh, like my brothers are like sharing this thing on Facebook. They're
Ask,
sharing
is it like Trump stuff or like
Candace Owens
oh okay.
and Trump stuff, but like
Yeah.
I was just like, what? And I'd have like one cousin would be like, did you see that they said this? And I said, I've unfriended, like I don't follow them. So I was like, I can't read it because it just is infuriating to me. Um, and I think some of it a little bit too was my younger sister started to see some of the stuff too.
Mhm.
And but yeah, I think it was a little bit later. Like I think I had this idea of like they can't be racist. Like there were other issues. Like I knew the other issues with adoption, as far as like and we can touch on this like later. I think you guys had mentioned, the idea of like forced gratitude as being
Mhm.
adoptee. So I
Yeah.
had so many other things to unpack that I kind of was like thinking about other stuff. But then when I realized, no, you can, like, adopting a black child doesn't make you anti-racist.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to check
I
your research.
really I
Why?
really liked what you said. Well, it's not maybe not liked, but it really I never thought about it this way, where you were like it's almost like people are scared, like people who adopt it, white people who adopt, it's like they're scared if they teach their black child how to be black and put them into the culture, like they're almost like scared that they're going to start hating white people and hating them. And
Mm-hmm.
that's almost kind of like ownership type of feeling, like we own you, like you have to be a part of us, and if
Mm-hmm.
you like those people, you're an outsider, and we don't know how to handle, our ego does not know how to handle that. And
Yeah.
it's like, that is so disturbing to me. Like,
And
Because
Selfish.
when I think about it, like, honestly, like, even with my own parents, as liberal as they are, as like, whatever, it's like they definitely have a we think this way. I mean, I think all humans feel, have that kind of mentality, but we think and do things this way. And like, we don't really go outside of that bubble. You know what I mean? And the fact that, because my sister, even, she was like, she asked my mom, my white sister, she was like, why does Hawa only hang out with Black people? And it's like,
Yeah.
it's such a
Why do you
weird
only hang out with
concept.
white people?
Yeah.
And
Well,
and I
and it's true because I definitely have gone the spectrum of having had a bunch of mostly white friends for a long time because that's
mhm,
all I had been around, to then now having, Black and other ethnicity friends and stuff too. I have Asian and all kinds of other stuff and white too. But I think you're right. Like I remember having some friends who were like the ones even that would kind of make the comments of like, oh yeah, you're the whitest Black girl I know, as
mhm,
left like that made me so cool.
mhm,
And and I think that was something that even internally I kind of struggled with in the
mhm,
last even few years of being like, I am Black and I want to be Black and
mhm,
I
Mhm.
want to have that like represented, in the sense of like I'm also an educated, a highly educated Black woman. So it's also important for me to have other educated, friends and stuff. But like
Mhm.
having this feeling that I had to feel a certain way about like, oh, do I have
mhm,
too many Black friends now? Are people gonna
mhm.
think
My
different
God,
things?
I went through that
Yeah.
too. I definitely, girl, I went through that. And that's something me and Fatmata have kind of talked about is like, as much as we hate to admit it, like because we're adopted, we did have some superiority complex as well. Like because we
Yeah.
were so closely associated with being white girl, whatever, like
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
it made us feel better about who we are and compared to other regular Black folks. And then
Yeah.
when we became adults and we had to live the world, live life as regular Black women, then
Yeah.
it's
Like
like,
you're not
to
different.
me, I don't know if you felt this way, Julie or Fatmata, but it's like I almost had to kind of regain my esteem and identity of who I am, not
Mhm.
associated with being associated as like a white Black girl. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Like there were times because this happened, late 20s for me. And I felt like, why am I having like I felt like these were things I should have dealt with or had felt when I was a teenager, kind of understanding like my identity. Why am I going through this as, an adult, educated
Yeah.
woman, and feeling like I don't even know how to feel like about being Black. And I
Mhm.
remember telling my mom this. I said, the thing is that as an adult, I now live the world of a Black woman.
Mhm.
mhm.
And that is, and I think when I told her that, it was kind of like oh.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, so for the first time now, I'm living the world of a Black woman.
Yeah.
And so I no longer can think in that white space idea that I had because there was this we don't see color kind of idea in my family and all that kind of stuff. And so I would not even always think about the fact that I was Black and that I had to maybe act accordingly on certain things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Um,
finish up what you were saying.
no, that's it.
Oh, okay. So, like, going back to what you were saying, like being an adult, you can't believe that you were like navigating this and like cultural identity and who you are as a Black person. Like, I totally can, both of us can relate because I'm still going through it. I'm 28, almost 30, still trying to figure it out. And there's times where I find myself like feeling that I want to still be accepted by white people. In that's something I've struggled with in growing up in a white community of like wanting to be accepted. That's all I did my entire life being there,
Mm,
changing my hair and the way I speak, the way I said things, the way I just carried myself. And I find myself like that part of me like coming up as an adult, like I do certain things. I'm like, and I had to catch myself like you're trying to be accepted by
mm,
white people. So that's like something that's like was like deeply ingrained in me and
mhm.
growing up in white people in the culture. And it's like, why do I still have that, and it's like, I don't know if you experience the same thing. It's like
Well,
I'm Black now,
I
like
think
living
so.
in
I
the
was
back.
talking to a friend of mine, my friend who's also an adoptee, and I was asking her we were talking through different things. And she was saying, one of the things is that we as humans want to
Hmm.
relate to other people.
Mhm.
That
Hmm.
is a thing that we have. And
Hmm.
so, because I was telling her how, like, it's only been more in recent years where I've really started to talk more about my identity as an adoptee,
Mm-hmm.
because I've kind of separated my identities of like being the black girl raised with a white family, or, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and then some other stuff from my, that I'll get touch into later, of like things that my parents did and stuff like that. But I didn't necessarily think about always like the adoptee part. And she said, well,
Mm-hmm.
part of that is like you're trying to find commonality to relate to people because we want to relate. And the
Mm-hmm.
hard part is that when you put us in a space where there are less that look like us, we have less than to connect. So we're trying to connect. Do we connect with
Mm-hmm.
how we talk,
Mm-hmm.
music? You know what I mean? Other stuff. So, I mean, for me, I think it was like I would connect with people like, oh, I was really raised, religiously like this, or we did
Mm-hmm.
this, or there were a lot of other things that you're trying to like relate with and have a commonality, and feel like you always have to find a space to make it common. And the sad part is that for some reason there's this pressure as the minority, especially as the
Mm-hmm.
black minority, to find something in common with the white person. It's never
Yeah.
the other way
Wow,
around.
that's so well
That
said.
is
It's
so true. Like,
so
and
well
I
put.
feel that way. I don't know about you guys. I feel that way when I'm in family gatherings with my adoptive family. It's like I always have to meet them to find
Mhm.
commonality with them and talk about their topics that they're interested in. It's never the other way around. Never,
And
ever.
I don't know how much of that is like put on us by society, because I find this in jobs. For me, this has been a big common one in jobs, where it's like I find this need to like try to find a commonality, make this person feel comfortable around me, because they're like, oh my word,
Mhm.
like
Oh my gosh,
she
yes.
walks into this room, she's gonna be X. And so like, how do we make her, like, how do we find something in common to talk? I'm like, I'm just a human being just like anybody else. We like
Yeah.
me, but there's this
Mhm.
pressure too. So I think that's part of the thing of like wanting to feel
Yeah.
accepted. I think for me, um I think once I found like my black friends that I felt super like
Mhm.
confident and comfortable with, I
Mhm.
felt like that's when my identity like came like fully. Where I
Yeah.
was like, oh, okay, like I have, and I have, and the neat thing is like they all are different. Like how you were talking about how social media showed like black does
Mhm.
not mean just one thing.
Mhm.
And so for me, having black friends that have had all different experiences and backgrounds, and all these different things, like they've put us together. And it's like, but then like we can have those conversations that you just can't have with
Mhm.
other people. And some of it is just like I went to a restaurant yesterday and it was nasty weather outside, and I was like, there's like nobody in here. And she said, oh, there's like a festival. The waitress was black. She's like, there's like a festival and blah blah blah. And I said, but in this weather? She's like, honey, a bunch of white folks, they don't care if they get wet. And I
Mhm.
like burst out laughing because we're then we start chatting about her hair. I was like, I don't want to get this wet. It's like, and like those types of just like fun bonding things was just like a complete stranger.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too, that whole like us having to like adapt to them, it really ties into racism and how white people just feel like they cannot connect with black people, and seeing black people as less than human. Like it's so hard for them to just like grasp like what black people may go through, like a black woman may go through. It's like they can't connect. And it's like it's black people can connect to y'all. Like if you're going through a certain emotion and certain things, we can connect because we know you're a human being. And so and
Yeah.
the other way around, it's like so hard for them to just like, and it's like, I'm a
Mhm.
human just like you are. And it just like ties into racism and
Yeah, it's
being
so much
like
like
less.
security. It's like I
Yes.
think of it kind of in comparison to like if you have a friend who is a girl who's like super popular and
Mm-hmm,
everybody goes and talks to her and they want to hear about her, and then you have one that's like maybe not as, I don't know, attractive, or it's just more insecure or whatever, like that person is always going to feel like they have to cater to the other person's
Mhm.
world. And that's
yeah.
how I've always felt like whenever I engage, even to this day, whenever I engage with like white folks at my work and stuff like that, it's like they're
Mm-hmm,
always leading the conversation,
mm-hmm,
and I just have to catch up and
Yep.
yeah.
be their fangirl. You know what I mean? And it's like,
Mhm.
so that's something I actually currently struggle with. Like you were saying, Julie, at work, it's
Yep.
like sometimes I just be their conversations. I'm just like, really? That's what you guys find funny? Or like, really? That's what you guys want to talk about? And it's like, I just have to go along.
Mhm.
And
Mhm,
I see that other Black girls are catering to those conversations and to what they find entertaining or what they
Yeah.
find interesting. So,
mhm,
um, yeah.
um one thing I was going to mention, because I know you guys had talked about this before, about this idea of like as an adoptee,
Mm-hmm.
being like basically a forced gratitude, like you're supposed to be grateful that you're an adoptee. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's something that I'm very cognizant about, is like you shouldn't put that on an adoptee.
Yeah.
I don't think you should put, like, you shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a sense of like, I'm glad that I'm an American. I'm glad, like, all these different things. But this idea of forced gratitude, I feel like also allows adopted parents to kind of get away with stuff that they shouldn't get away with,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
because
Oh.
oh, they're adopted. So the narrative, for me, that I grew up with, like, the entire thing was like, oh, these two white parents went to Africa and they adopted these two little black girls and they
Yep.
saved their lives and they brought them here, and oh my word, it's so awesome. And I was thinking to myself, okay, they adopted us, but then they brought us to the United States, and then I lived in poverty in the United States, like below
Mm-hmm.
poverty. So, huh? How did
Mm-hmm.
they get this like love, pass card, so that basically people would think like they could do no wrong? So then,
Mm-hmm.
me growing up as a kid, anytime I would be like, well, so why are we doing this, or why can't we do this? Just normal
Mm-hmm.
kid questions. You'd be like, well, we went to Africa and we
Mm-hmm.
adopted you. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, you can't do, like, don't. Because it wasn't my choice. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't, like, you guys decided you wanted to adopt me. I'm just here. I'm the child here. Be a parent, raise your kids. But this idea of like, oh, you must just be so thankful and so grateful. And I'm like, yeah, that just
Yeah.
doesn't work.
Yeah.
Wait, so that's so interesting. Most people who, me and Famata talk about this too. It's like a lot of people assume that when you adopt, um, like as a white parent or whatever, like you're going to be automatically wealthy and rich. And so we
Yeah.
just kind of, found out, I think for the most part, everyone we've spoken to has, maybe they're not super, super wealthy, but they've
Mm-hmm.
never been like poverty level or anything. And that's something that you kind of mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very interesting and different. How was that like, being adopted? Was there a transition from maybe they had some money and then they went more poverty side, or like how did that pan out?
So my dad is very um like a hippie from the 70s kind of person, who's like, oh, like,
Mm-hmm.
just want to do everything super cheap and kind of prove to the world what I can do and all that kind of
Right.
stuff.
Mhm, mhm,
And so that was a lot of the attitude. Now, when we were overseas, there was kind of like a certain thing that they, kind of had to live and had to do certain stuff. And of course, everybody was living a certain way. So it didn't
Mm-hmm.
really, there wasn't really a disparity in a sense.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But coming back to the US and then just being like, oh, I just want to do everything really cheap and really bare bones. And so yeah, I think that was really hard for me, because I would watch and I would hear people say, like, when we would travel or we go to different churches, and people would be like, oh my gosh, like, you're adopted, and like, that's just so wonderful. And I'm thinking in my head, like, we don't have proper heat. We don't have, and in Minnesota. So Famanta,
Mm-hmm.
you understand, like, that's,
Yeah.
a problem.
Huge.
Um so not proper heat, not proper, like, utilities. Sometimes we'd have electricity. Sometimes my dad would be like, oh, let's like rough it. Like, we're gonna, like, and so all these things and so in my head I was like, how great is this? Like, yeah,
Right.
it's better than Africa, but that's not saying much.
Yeah.
And so I think that was one of the things I struggled with, and
Mm,
only been more in the recent years, being more like confident now and comfortable when, retelling the narrative, in the sense when people would be like, oh my word, like, you were adopted, and like, these families they were missionaries and they adopted these two girls. And I was like, yeah, but then I was raised below the poverty line. And they were
Yeah.
like, huh?
yeah, it doesn't make sense for
it,
people. Like they
and it
don't.
doesn't make sense, because I think part of the thing was like, if you go back to a couple things, one, if you go back to the savior mentality, the white
Mm-hmm.
savior mentality, where like, I did this wonderful act by doing this, I
Mm-hmm.
saved these two children, which is like, okay, yes, you did, but it's what you do for the next, like, you still have to raise the kid and put in the work.
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do it. And so, but then I feel like society just looks at, oh my gosh, like you've adopted, so therefore you have to be at this other, pedestal.
Yeah.
And so I feel like if you're going to adopt children, like you need to do extra work. Not saying
Mhm.
that, like, I don't know. I'm not a biological child to a parent that I'm raised with. And I think you should obviously do a lot to any child that you have. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but I'm just saying that if you're going to adopt, it requires more work
Hmm.
and more effort. Not just like, I'm just going to like bring them in and like, keep it all the same.
Yeah.
Are there any particular things that you wished your parents had maybe done more of or done less of or exposed you to a certain different way of living? Like what areas? Because I know my mom, she always asks me like, oh, well, what could we have done better? We don't know, I don't know if she really wants to hear the answer, but but for the people who are listening, Julie, like, is there like areas where you feel like they could have done better or like, you know?
I think one big area is if you adopt a child that is a different ethnicity as your child, don't raise them to be the ethnicity that you are. And I
Hmm.
don't mean like in awkward ways, because I remember I'd hear people say that and then they would do strange things, like not strange, but like they would do things like buy a bunch of like African art and then stick it up in their house. And I was like, that's not what I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. Now, if that's what your child wants, that's fine. But
Hmm.
what I'm saying is expose them to people who can have an input in their life. I think
Hmm.
something that my parents did not do well was they wanted to be my parents and be the only thing in my life as
Hmm.
of any influence. I think
Mhm.
it's why they also wanted to keep limitations on other things. It's also why, I was protected in this very bubble. But there
Hmm.
was no one else to speak into my life. And the problem is that they knew nothing about anything about how my any of the struggles I'd have as in my life.
Hmm.
And I couldn't expect two white people to have had those same experiences.
Hmm.
And I think something that can also happen is you can't sometimes, so like my mom as a child had lived in Ghana for a few years with her dad who worked for the government. And so I would tell her like, oh, these people are like wanting to touch my hair. And so my mom would say, well, I remember being a kid in Ghana and like, some of the Ghanaians would come up and want to touch my hair because, my hair's so straight and so different. And I was like, okay. Now as an adult, what I realized the problem with that narrative and that story was that even her as the kid that was maybe different and stood out in Ghana, yes, little white kid is going to stand out,
Hmm.
but she was standing out as like a goddess,
Oh, yeah,
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
huge.
Ooh.
Yeah. Wow.
not us standing out like
Wow.
we're from
Hmm.
some zoo.
Yeah. Wow. Girl, you
And so
said
I
that.
so
I
for
know.
me, and I
She's.
think for me, then I was like, oh, that was what the problem was with with that saying that you still
Hmm.
don't understand what I'm going through. People are
Yeah.
like, oh, I haven't seen this except for on like a TV. And I was like, that
Yeah, and
just
it's once again, it goes back to white people having a hard time seeing black people as human beings and trying to relate. Like it's like just cannot relate. Like
it's
so
all
hard.
and it's
Yeah.
like not even always sometimes just like as human beings. It's like there's this group of people that are black and we just don't
Yeah.
understand anything about them. And it's like
Yeah.
there is. So I would say have people in your life where your child can have
Hmm.
conversations with and feel
Hmm.
comfortable to have those conversations with. Obviously, I think therapy is great, but I also
Mm.
think like, having that space. And if that means putting yourself in a slightly more uncomfortable situation, I mean,
Hmm.
obviously it's going to be a little bit different if you have if you have a bunch of different ethnicities in your family or whatever, but
Hmm.
I would say, doing that, I think was one thing. Another thing is don't hold your acts that you did as far as adopting a child over the adoptee's head.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, don't don't
Yeah.
weaponize that. You should never
Hmm.
weaponize that. That should never be weaponized.
Yeah.
So I think those are some, common things. And like talking to hearing other people talk about these struggles, I feel
Hmm.
like is a good support system because that is the only way, that's when you feel seen and heard. Because when I realized I heard a podcast a few years ago, and a lady said, the thing with adoption is all adoption is birthed out of trauma.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
And so she's like, we paint it as this like beautiful picture, oh, you went and you adopted this child, and there's the beauty of it, of like this new other life that you get to have, and but there's the trauma part.
Yeah.
And the trauma part is that, people, and you've said this in other podcasts, people should be born and raised with that's the idea, that's the perfect world. Now we all know that there are situations where obviously that can't happen, but because of that, there's trauma that comes with that. Obviously it's going to be different. Your guys' trauma is going to be different because you guys were older when you were adopted, but the idea is still there, because even though me coming in, as a little baby, there's still so many feelings and things that you guys will talk about. I'm like, oh my gosh, I felt that too. I felt that too. Okay, so like being adopted, like it is like you just feelings of abandonment hit in a very different way. Like even you be triggered by other abandonment very differently than it feels than like somebody who wasn't adopted. It doesn't matter how you were given up, even if it was in the best situation. It still, triggers. And so
It
I
exists.
think remembering that, like when you're adopting a child, like there is going to be trauma with that. And at some point in their life, they might be young, they might be older, they need to navigate that. But that's something that I think is important.
Yeah, well, so well said. And so one thing I want to ask you, now that you're older and that you are forming your own identity and who you are as a Black woman, have you figured out a way how to like connect to your culture, like being Cameroonian and like your culture, the food? Have you like figured out how to connect in that way? Because
Or is
So
that even important to you, actually?
yeah,
Because
yeah, is that
yeah.
important to you?
yeah, and so that's funny because my husband has asked me that before, because like as I've kind of come through and like definitely, my finding my identity as like a Black woman, as an
Mhm.
educated Black woman, as a Black woman attorney, like finding myself in
Huge.
spaces that are just not very many of us, less
Yeah.
than 5% of lawyers are Black. So like already that's
Hmm.
nothing. I still haven't really come around on exactly on the Cameroonian stuff.
Hmm.
Sometimes I feel like it's not as important to me.
Hmm.
Um,
It makes sense. You were adopted when you were a baby, so
yes, I was
that's
adopted
how
as a
and I we had a
baby.
little connection to
Yeah,
it.
and the
So.
connection that I think the hard part is like the connection that I had was tainted, obviously. And I think there was some too with just like, and I'm kind of like seeing this now older, is that there was some superiority of this, like, where the white missionary families, here in this culture, and there was, and I remember hearing, some negative things about like, oh, Africans do this or Cameroonians do that. And I just wanted like distance and
Hmm.
space from that. And so I feel
Hmm.
like I haven't really found a way to really like mesh the two.
Hmm.
Because sometimes my husband's like, do you want to go to Cameroon? I was like, no, don't really have a desire to.
Yeah.
And and he's like, well, he's like, well, what if we have a child, and the child, and I was like, I mean, I'll cross that bridge. It's not also been a safe place to visit. Northern Cameroon has been not safe, so I feel like that's been a part of it. um I think for me, my identity is at this point has still been a lot more as like an African American and as like
Hmm.
a Black woman,
Hmm.
and in that way more so than just being Cameroonian. And I think because I have less connection, to
Hmm.
it, um, with it. So, but I also know that like, I'm still evolving. Like sometimes I
Yeah.
feel like so many of these things I'm learning so much later in my life. I'm like, I'm already in my 30s. Like I feel like these are things that like most people are figuring out like in the teen years, but you can't when you don't have
Yeah.
these platforms, these conversations, these people, you
Yeah.
know.
Everyone has their own journey and how to get
Yeah,
into
exactly.
I feel like
grown.
you can't really rush the process, and like
No.
your identity for us, I think is always going to kind of be a big thing because we're
Yes.
always trying to figure out how to associate ourselves with our environment and the
Hmm.
new phases in life that we're in. I'm sure when you got married, I'm not sure if your husband is Black or white or whatever race, but I'm sure when you got married, you had to like kind of re-identify with yourself and
Hmm.
not necessarily of your Africanness, right? Of like you being Cameroonian, but or not, African, but you being Cameroonian, but like of who am I just in general? What's my identity, right? Like, how do I feel about myself? Do I
Hmm.
feel whole in who I am? It's like that
Yeah.
esteem, I think, is always going to be a big conversation for adoptees,
Mhm.
even
And
if you were adopted
especially,
at a young age.
yeah, and I think especially as like a transracial adoptee,
Mhm.
and then also like I think something for me like with identity is there's so many layers to my identity
Yeah.
where and I'm like, okay, so I'm black, I'm Cameroonian, I'm an immigrant,
Mhm.
because I didn't get my immigration, like I didn't become a US citizen until I was 10. So you better believe I remember that process. You know what I mean? Like, so there's that. Then being raised in a poverty, not in a great education, like all those different things, and then you add your identities as an adult, like you said,
Mhm.
your profession, and getting married. I'm in a biracial relationship, so my husband's white, so like you add layers and layers and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And so I think there's different stages in your life where different parts of your identity are like, come. And I think as I become more confident and comfortable in one, I think I
Mhm.
expose, you can kind of expose another one to kind of be like, okay, like how do I feel about this? I think for me
Yeah.
for a while it was like I didn't even have the capacity to even hardly talk about being adoptee because
Mm.
people aren't, and then there's the complex of like, okay, you're adopted, but then like, okay, what about the family that you're adopted with? And I was like, yeah, there's a whole lot of problems with that too. And they're like, okay. And I'm
Mhm.
like, yeah, I know. And so it just adds a lot of layers.
Do you still have a relationship with your adoptive family? And if so, what does that relationship look like? And if you don't have a relationship, if you want to maybe share like a little bit of
Mhm.
why, you don't have to go too deep, as comfortable as you like.
Y-
Mhm.
Yeah. So I have somewhat of a relationship, I would say.
Okay.
Um, with my two older brothers, not much in the last like decade. I think politically, like they ended up living up north and just like kind of one's in North Dakota, one's in Wisconsin, just
Mhm.
very, kind of embedded in like the Trump,
Mm.
that kind of stuff. And so all of that, like, and then just lifestyle too, which is very, very different. One's a
Mhm.
trucker and has a ranch, and that kind of lifestyle, all that kind of stuff. And I live in Atlanta, I'm a lawyer, so just very, very different lifestyles.
Mhm.
So I think there was that. Never really had a close relationship with my dad.
Mm.
Mhm.
My personality and my dad's are very different, and I think I always kind of struggled with thinking that like, oh, like I never had the daddy daughter kind of thing. And so it was like, oh, am I supposed to? But it's not, and like all that kind of stuff. And as I got older, I kind of realized like that was never my story, that was never what it was.
Mhm.
um a little bit closer to my mom, and so I have a little bit more relationship with her to some degree, but um things are definitely a lot more, I would say, kind of strained. Like, I see them, when you text every once in a while and different things like that, but a lot more things kind of came up about a year and a half ago when I lost my sister. And
Mhm.
so
So
just
sorry
it
for your loss.
opened up, thank you, it opened up just a lot of things, and it's when I
Mm.
really started to see the issues, and to
Mhm.
see that none of this was stuff I was really making up or anything like that.
Mhm.
And so I think that definitely put a lot more distance on it.
Mhm.
But I am fortunate that my aunts and uncles and stuff like that are awesome. So I have, and like my grandparents were awesome too. Like they've since passed away, but like my mom's
Mhm.
parents were like second parents to me. And so like I had like an interesting with like the close knit family, not so
Mhm.
much. My sister and I were super, super close. But like I have aunts and uncles that are just, they're like, oh, like I'm gonna see one of them. They're like, oh, like we're gonna go do this together. So
That's
I
sweet.
have some family that definitely was like, oh yeah, like we love you, and like you're very much a part of our family, and like we're so proud of like how far you've come. And so that's been neat to see
Yeah.
too, because
That's
I
beautiful.
came from, a poor background with not a strong education, and then going from that to becoming a lawyer. So some of them with that, but I definitely understand the lack of relationship, because I think Famata, you mentioned that, and
Yeah.
there's just conversations I just can't have, and I don't even try to have, because if I did have them, they wouldn't understand it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just keep it very surface.
Mm-hmm.
I send
Right.
them pictures of my dog. I tell them if I get a new job,
Yeah.
and that's about it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're kind of coming to the end of the conversation, but if, Famata, if you have any questions, like closing questions, because we've gotten to learn so much about you, Julie. And honestly, I feel like we've just kind of scratched a little bit of like the surface.
Yeah.
So we're always like so happy to like have a host, I mean a guest come in again a different time, because again, there's so much depth and layers in these adoptive stories, and we're really just scratching the surface for just what it means to be adopted in the first place. And
Mhm.
um yeah, we really are so appreciative of you coming. I know Fatmata had like a couple of closing questions for you before we end up actually leaving.
Yeah, one thing I want to like close out, as adoptees, we experience so much, from being adopted and living in an environment where no one looks like us, and that can be very traumatic. And
Mhm.
I always like to ask this question, like, if you could speak to your younger self and you're sitting in front of her, what would you say?
Mm, that is a really good question. Um, I think one thing I would definitely tell my younger self is that you're not alone.
Mm,
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 I think that was something, and that like you're not alone and you're not crazy.
yeah.
And I
yeah.
know it sounds funny, like
Yes.
dramatic to
No.
say crazy, but I definitely felt as a younger, like, was I over analyzing this? Why was I
Hmm.
feeling this way? Why, for example, um, just wanting to fit in. And
Hmm.
I remember my parents being like, we don't want you to like be like other people. We want you to be Julie. Like, we love Julie. And I was like, okay. But
Hmm.
then what I realized as I got older, like my family is extremely extroverted. And so I had to learn to be extroverted. But in like, I realized that I overcompensated for myself, in the sense of I knew that if I walked into a room, I was going
Hmm.
to be remembered because I was the only Black girl who was going to walk into the room.
Hmm.
So I made it a concerted effort I wanted to be known for being more than just the Black girl.
Hmm.
So I was going to be known for like, I was super polite and I was super poised and super organized. And I put all these pressures on myself to like be known for more than just being known as a Black girl.
Mm,
Hmm.
But the hard part was that in reality, like, I would have rather just been able to like kind of walk into a room, not be
Hmm.
noticed, kind of be able to come in and go out. That's never been my experience.
Hmm.
Like growing up or anything. That's one of the reasons I do love Atlanta, because I can walk into the store and it's
Yeah.
no big deal, and things like that. And so not feeling like I was crazy. And I think the problem is because my parents were white, raised with their white biological family, couldn't even conceptualize anything that I was going through. And of course, I'm a child, so I can't express what I'm going
Hmm.
through. I don't even have the words to think about this. I'm just like, okay, so what can I do that makes me fit in a little bit more? Okay, if I wear this might help. I'm still Black. I'm
Hmm.
still, and I'm in, northern Minnesota is like not just white, but there are Norwegian white, German white. So not even white with a lot of diversity within
Hmm.
the whiteness. So I was like, of course, thinking in my head, like, I'm not gonna fit in. Like, I'm, still brown girl. But
Yeah.
that I think is something that I would tell myself is like, you're not alone, you're not
Hmm.
crazy, and you'll get through this. And my hope is that as social media is the way it is, less people will have to face those feelings of
Hmm.
aloneness for as long, and that they would hopefully be more exposed to
Hmm.
hearing other stories of other people, and then being like, oh, okay, like this is common. Like, I definitely thought so many things I went through was
Hmm.
just me,
Yeah.
and realizing, nah, I'm being adopted even at a young age, it doesn't matter, I'm still an adoptee.
Yeah, that is so well put and beautifully put, because I feel a lot of us, transracial adoptees, we do feel alone. Even though we live in a house full of people, it's like we feel alone because we feel like no one can actually connect to us in the issue that we feel. And I totally can relate because I felt just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But we're so happy that you could come on this podcast and tell your story. We hope that you got what you needed from this, and hopefully in the future, like, we would love to have you again because you were an amazing.
Yes. I definitely want to stay in touch with you guys because you guys
Yeah,
have
for sure.
definitely been
Yeah,
very helpful for me as I've like tried to navigate a space
yeah.
feeling a little bit more alone without my sister. And so it's definitely
Hmm.
been very
Hmm.
comforting to be like, okay, there's these other girls out there that have
Yeah,
felt this and that are okay with talking about this, and I can like
yeah,
randomly message Fatima or whatever.
yeah.
I'm like, I'm gonna Instagram message you something like totally
Absolutely.
random.
So just thank you so much for coming on this podcast. And I hope whoever's watching this can relate and they were able to get something from this. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, let your friends and family know that we exist. And if you want to
Mhm.
be on this podcast, please let us know. Until next time. Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.